Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts, ascended to the throne at a pivotal moment in British history, when the fate of the monarchy hung in the balance. Her reign, though often overshadowed by the grandeur of earlier monarchs, carved its own legacy, one of political intrigue, personal struggles, and profound transformation. As the final link in the storied Stuart dynasty, Queen Anne's time on the throne would mark not just the end of an era, but the beginning of a new chapter that would forever alter the course of the British monarchy. Her story, filled with triumphs and tragedies, is as much about the battles she fought as the battles fought on her behalf, a monarch who presided over a kingdom in flux, and yet, whose impact continues to resonate in the annals of British history. Queen Anne holds a uniquely significant place in British history, not merely because she was the last monarch of the House of Stuart, but also because her reign marked a pivotal transitional period for the British Isles. Born in 1665, and became queen in 1702 and ruled until her death in 1714. Her reign was short compared to some of her predecessors and successors, yet it was filled with events that would shape the future of Britain for centuries. From the War of the Spanish Succession to the Act of Union between England and Scotland, Anne's rule was a bridge between the old Stuart world of dynastic rule and the new Hanoverian era characterized by a more constitutional monarchy. Understanding Queen Anne's reign is crucial to grasping the larger story of British political development. The Stuart dynasty had been fraught with religious conflicts, civil wars, and tensions between monarchy and parliament. Queen Anne inherited this complicated legacy. Her rule would not only see the resolution of some of these issues but would also lay the foundation for the modern United Kingdom. Under Anne, political parties like the Tories and Whigs began to solidify into more recognizable forms. She was also the last monarch to veto an Act of Parliament, an act that underscores the shift in power from the throne to the legislative body. By studying Anne's reign, we come to understand the closing chapter of Stuart absolutism and the opening chapter of constitutional monarchy, a hallmark of the Britain we know today. The importance of Queen Anne's reign extends beyond mere political mechanics. Her life was deeply marked by personal tragedy, which in turn affected her governance, and endured numerous miscarriages, stillbirths, and the early deaths of her children. The absence of a surviving heir had profound consequences for the succession of the English throne. Her struggles with health, compounded by gout and obesity in later life, made her physically weak and often left her reliant on close advisors and favorites, such as Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. These personal challenges impacted her decision-making and her relationships with ministers, ultimately influencing the political landscape of the time. The transition from the Stuart era to the Hanoverian monarchy is one of the most critical elements of Queen Anne's historical role. With no surviving children, the question of succession loomed large throughout her reign. The Act of Settlement 1701 had already determined that the English throne would pass to the Protestant House of Hanover, bypassing numerous Catholic claimants. Anne's death thus marked not just the end of a dynasty but the beginning of a new, fundamentally different chapter in British history. The accession of George I of Hanover would firmly establish Protestantism as the bedrock of the British monarchy and would further shift power away from the sovereign towards Parliament, solidifying the constitutional monarchy model. Several key themes define Queen Anne's time on the throne. Personal struggles form a major part of her story. Anne's repeated pregnancies and profound personal losses gave her a melancholic air that shaped both public perception and private decision-making. She was a figure of sympathy but also of stubbornness, a monarch who was both deeply human and deeply royal. Political turmoil was another defining feature of her reign. The early 18th century was a time of fierce party rivalry. The Whigs and Tories were not simply political groups but powerful coalitions that could sway the course of wars and royal policies. Queen Anne's own sympathies leaned towards the Tories, especially later in her reign, but she was constantly pulled between the two parties, depending on circumstances and personalities at court. This constant political struggle made her court a hotbed of intrigue, alliance, and betrayal, all playing out against the backdrop of a Europe embroiled in the War of the Spanish Succession. Perhaps the most significant achievement of Queen Anne's reign was the union of England and Scotland in 1707. The Act of Union created the Kingdom of Great Britain, forging a political and economic alliance that would stand the test of time. Though the union was controversial and met with resistance on both sides of the border, it represented a major step towards the formation of the modern British state. Queen Anne's role in this achievement was not merely ceremonial. She worked diligently behind the scenes to ensure its success, understanding that the future strength of Britain depended on a unified kingdom. Thus, Queen Anne's reign, though often overshadowed by more flamboyant monarchs before and after her, remains a cornerstone of British history. Her life reflects a monarchy in transition, caught between ancient traditions and emerging modern structures. Through her personal resilience, political navigation, and key achievements like the Act of Union, Queen Anne left an enduring legacy. The end of her reign closed the chapter on Stuart absolutism and opened the door to the Britain that would soon dominate the world stage. Her story is a complex, deeply human narrative of loss, power, and transformation, making it essential to any thorough understanding of the British monarchy's evolution. The story of the Stuart dynasty is one of ambition, turbulence, and an enduring struggle between royal authority and the rights of the people. Long before Queen Anne ascended the throne, the Stuart family had already left a complex and often violent imprint on British history. Originating from Scotland, the Stuarts first came to power in England in 1603 with the union of the Scottish and English crowns under James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. This dynastic union was a momentous event, symbolizing the beginning of a shared monarchy between the two historically distinct kingdoms. James I's ascent to the English throne marked the start of the Stuart dynasty's reign over England, Scotland, and Ireland, but also the beginning of a century marked by profound religious conflicts, political upheaval, and social transformation. James I, the first Stuart king of England, was a complex and intelligent monarch who brought with him an ideal of divine right monarchy, that kings ruled by God's will and were accountable only to God. This belief often placed him at odds with the increasingly assertive English Parliament, which sought a greater role in governance. James's reign saw the commissioning of the King James Bible, a lasting achievement, but it was also marred by financial difficulties, unpopular foreign policies, and tensions over religious reforms. His efforts to forge a closer relationship with Catholic Spain and his tolerance towards Catholics alienated many Protestant subjects, setting the stage for deeper religious divisions that would haunt his successors. Following James I, his son Charles I inherited the throne in 1625, and soon proved even less adept at navigating the stormy waters of English politics. Like his father, Charles I firmly believed in the divine right of kings, but his unwillingness to compromise with Parliament exacerbated existing tensions. His attempts to impose religious uniformity across England and Scotland, including the controversial introduction of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer in Scotland, triggered widespread resentment. Matters came to a head when Charles attempted to rule without Parliament for 11 years, a period known as the Personal Rule, and when he eventually reconvened Parliament, it was clear that the relationship between king and legislative body was irreparably broken. The result was the English Civil War, a brutal conflict that pitted royalists, supporters of the king, against parliamentarians. After years of fighting, Charles I was defeated, tried for treason, and executed in 1649, a shocking event that sent ripples throughout Europe. For the first time, a reigning English monarch had been publicly tried and put to death by his own subjects, a dramatic assertion of the principle that the monarch could be held accountable by the people. In the aftermath, England became a republic under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, entering a period known as the Commonwealth. The monarchy had been abolished, and it seemed, for a time, that the Stuart experiment in divine monarchy had been decisively ended. Yet the Stuart legacy was not so easily extinguished. Following Cromwell's death and the collapse of the Protectorate, there was a widespread desire to restore stability through the re-establishment of the monarchy. In 1660, Charles II, son of the executed king, was invited to return to England and reclaim the throne in what became known as the Restoration. Charles II was a more pragmatic ruler than his father, understanding the need to work with Parliament to some extent. However, his reign was still fraught with difficulties, including devastating events like the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London. Religious tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface, especially due to Charles's secret sympathies towards Catholicism and his overt alliance with Catholic France later in his reign. Charles II's lack of legitimate children meant that the succession passed to his brother, James, Duke of York, who became James II. James's open Catholicism, however, proved disastrous in a predominantly Protestant nation. His attempts to promote Catholics to high office, suspend anti-Catholic laws, and create a standing army loyal to himself raised widespread alarm. Fears of a Catholic absolutist monarchy became acute when James's second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, ensuring a Catholic succession. These fears culminated in what is known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Glorious Revolution was less a violent uprising and more a carefully orchestrated coup. Key political figures invited William of Orange, the Protestant husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to invade England and depose James II. William's arrival with a Dutch fleet and army caused James to flee to France without significant bloodshed. Parliament subsequently offered the throne jointly to William and Mary, establishing the principle that sovereignty derived from Parliament and the people, not solely from divine right. The Glorious Revolution thus marked a profound transformation in the English political system, fundamentally altering the balance of power between monarchy and Parliament. In the wake of the Glorious Revolution, several important legislative changes cemented the new political reality. Chief among these was the Bill of Rights of 1689, which laid out specific limits on royal power and enumerated certain rights of Parliament and individuals. It barred Catholics from the throne and prohibited monarchs from suspending laws or raising taxes without Parliament's consent. These reforms were reinforced by the Act of Settlement in 1701, which further clarified the line of succession. With William and Mary having no surviving children, and Mary's sister and being the next in line, the Act declared that if and had no heirs, the throne would pass to Sophia of Hanover and her Protestant descendants. The Act of Settlement ensured that no Catholic could ever again rule Britain, reflecting the deeply entrenched religious fears that had shaped the previous century of Stuart rule. This period of Stuart history is characterized by deep instability. At every turn, questions of religion, governance, and royal authority sparked crises that threatened to tear the nation apart. The Civil War, the execution of a king, a decade-long republic, the Restoration, and a bloodless revolution all point to a monarchy that was far from secure. The very notion of kingship had been fundamentally questioned, and monarchs now had to operate within clearly defined limits or risk deposition. By the time Queen Anne ascended the throne in 1702, she inherited not only a crown but the weight of a century's worth of instability and redefined royal power, and was deeply aware of her precarious position. Though personally devoted to the Anglican Church and the ideals of monarchy, she understood that her authority was constrained by the parliamentary system that had evolved through her predecessors' failures. She ruled a Britain still scarred by religious divisions, still haunted by the specter of civil war, and still struggling to define the relationship between the governed and their governors. The Stuart dynasty before and, therefore, presents a backdrop of fragile legitimacy and constant negotiation between old ideas of absolute monarchy and new realities of constitutional governance. It was a dynasty marked by dramatic personalities and fateful decisions, each contributing to the slow, often painful evolution of Britain's political identity. The recurring clashes between monarch and parliament, the ever-present religious discord, and the gradual acceptance of parliamentary supremacy all set the stage for Anne's own reign and the eventual end of the Stuart line. The world Anne stepped into was one defined by caution, compromise, and a keen awareness of history's heavy hand, shaping her rule and ultimately Britain's future. Anne was born on February 6, 1665, at St. James's Palace in London, into a world already marked by tension and uncertainty. She was the second daughter of James, Duke of York, who would later become King James II of England and VII of Scotland, and his first wife, Anne Hyde. Her birth placed her firmly within the royal succession, though at the time few could have predicted the immense role she would eventually play in shaping Britain's future. The Stuart dynasty, to which she belonged, was already dealing with deep-rooted religious and political divisions, and Anne's early life would be heavily influenced by these larger historical forces. Anne's family background was deeply intertwined with the religious conflicts that were tearing England apart. Her father, James, was a committed Catholic, a fact that would increasingly alienate him from a predominantly Protestant nation. Anne's mother and Hyde had converted to Catholicism after her marriage, but both daughters, Mary and Anne, were raised as Protestants in accordance with the prevailing wishes of the royal family and Parliament. This decision would prove crucial, not only in Anne's personal identity but also in determining her eventual acceptance by the English people. The death of Anne's mother in 1671, when Anne was just 6 years old, left a profound impact on the young princess. Her father's subsequent marriage to Mary of Modena, an Italian Catholic princess, further complicated the already fragile relationship between the Stuart monarchy and its Protestant subjects. Anne's early years were spent navigating these complex family dynamics, growing up in an environment of political intrigue and religious tension. Her father's staunch Catholicism, combined with his autocratic tendencies, would later lead to his downfall and deeply affect Anne's own political instincts. Anne's relationship with her father was a complicated mixture of affection, loyalty, and political necessity. Despite their religious differences, Anne maintained a strong filial bond with James. She respected his authority and was deeply influenced by his views on monarchy and duty. However, as political events unfolded, Anne found herself having to balance her loyalty to her father with the demands of her Protestant faith and her own political survival. This internal conflict would shape much of her later life and reign. Anne's early education was typical for a royal princess of her time, focused largely on religious instruction, decorum, and the arts deemed suitable for a young lady of noble birth. She was not a particularly scholarly child, and her education was not as rigorous as that of her older sister, Mary. Nevertheless, Anne developed a strong sense of personal piety and a steadfast commitment to the Church of England, traits that would earn her the trust and affection of her Protestant subjects later in life. Her tutors emphasized obedience, modesty, and religious devotion, reinforcing the values that would come to define her reign. The influence of Anne's stepmother, Queen Mary of Modena, was a source of both support and strain. Mary of Modena was by all accounts a kind and loving stepmother, but her Catholic faith and foreign origins made her deeply unpopular in England. As Anne grew older, she became increasingly aware of the public's hostility toward Mary and the threat that a Catholic succession posed to the stability of the realm. Although Anne maintained a cordial relationship with her stepmother, she was also pragmatic, understanding that her own future depended on aligning herself with the Protestant cause. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had a seismic impact on Anne's life. When her father, King James II, was deposed in favor of his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband, William of Orange, Anne found herself caught in a web of personal and political loyalties. Initially hesitant, and ultimately sided with the revolutionaries, a decision that deeply wounded her relationship with her father but secured her place in the Protestant succession. James II's flight to France, where he lived out his days in exile at the court of Louis XIV, marked the end of his reign and the beginning of a new chapter for Anne. During these turbulent years, Anne experienced the pain of exile herself, though not in the same way as her father. She remained in England, but the emotional and psychological distance from her family created a sense of isolation. The political instability of the period forced Anne to navigate a treacherous landscape, balancing loyalty, ambition, and survival. Her early experiences of betrayal, displacement, and divided loyalties would leave lasting scars, shaping her cautious and sometimes indecisive approach to governance. Anne's personal life was marred by profound struggles, chief among them her persistent health issues. From a young age, Anne suffered from a range of ailments, including eye infections, gout, and other chronic illnesses. Her fragile health often confined her to her chambers and limited her public appearances, fostering a sense of vulnerability that would accompany her throughout her life. Despite her physical frailty, Anne demonstrated remarkable resilience, cultivating a stoic acceptance of her condition and a deep reliance on her faith. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching aspect of Anne's personal life was her repeated experiences of maternal loss. Over the course of her marriage to Prince George of Denmark, Anne endured at least 17 pregnancies, resulting in numerous miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths. Only one child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, survived infancy, but he too died at the age of 11. These personal tragedies had a profound impact on Anne, both emotionally and politically. Her inability to produce a surviving heir cast a shadow over her reign and intensified the succession crisis that loomed over the Stuart dynasty. Anne's grief over the loss of her children was compounded by the immense pressure she faced as a queen and potential mother of the nation. Each pregnancy was fraught with political significance, raising hopes for a stable Protestant succession. Each loss, therefore, was not only a personal sorrow but also a public disappointment. The repeated cycle of hope and despair took a heavy toll on Anne's health and spirit, reinforcing her reputation as a tragic and somewhat melancholic figure. Throughout these personal and political trials, Anne developed a small but close circle of trusted confidants, most notably Sarah Churchill, later the Duchess of Marlborough. The intense and sometimes turbulent friendship between Anne and Sarah would become one of the defining relationships of Anne's life, influencing both her personal happiness and political decisions. Anne's need for emotional support and loyalty, born from her early experiences of betrayal and loss, made her deeply dependent on a few chosen individuals, a trait that would sometimes lead to accusations of favoritism and weakness. Anne's early life, marked by political upheaval, personal tragedy, and physical suffering, forged in her a complex character. She was at once deeply conservative, valuing tradition and stability, and personally resilient, capable of enduring immense hardship without complaint. Her strong sense of duty, shaped by her religious convictions and personal losses, prepared her for the enormous challenges she would face as queen. Yet the scars of her early experiences would never entirely heal, influencing her reign in ways both subtle and profound. By the time Anne ascended the throne in 1702, she was a seasoned survivor of court intrigue and political upheaval. Her early life had taught her the importance of balancing personal loyalty with political necessity, a skill that would serve her well during her reign. Anne's deep commitment to the Church of England, born of her upbringing and education, would become a cornerstone of her policies. Her personal resilience, tempered by years of ill health and personal loss, would enable her to weather the storms of war, political division, and personal betrayal that marked her time on the throne. Anne's story is, in many ways, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. Her early life was shaped by forces beyond her control: dynastic ambition, religious conflict, and personal tragedy, but she managed to carve out a path that would lead her to become one of Britain's most significant monarchs. In the crucible of her early years, Anne developed the qualities that would define her reign: a deep sense of duty, an unwavering commitment to her faith, and a quiet but formidable strength of character. Her journey from a vulnerable princess to a reigning queen was neither smooth nor inevitable. It was the result of a lifetime spent navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics, surviving personal heartbreaks, and steadfastly adhering to her principles. Anne's early life was not merely a prelude to her reign. It was the crucible in which her character was forged, preparing her to face the immense responsibilities and challenges that awaited her on the throne. Her story, rich with personal sacrifice and political drama, remains a poignant reminder of the complex interplay between personal destiny and historical forces. The dawn of the 18th century found England in a state of considerable political transition, marked by tension, uncertainty, and a careful balancing of competing interests. Queen Anne's rise to the throne in 1702 came against this intricate backdrop, as the country grappled with questions of succession, religious identity, and international standing. Her ascension was not merely a ceremonial event. It represented the culmination of years of political maneuvering and legal groundwork intended to secure Protestant succession and preserve constitutional monarchy after the turbulence of previous decades. The political situation preceding Anne's ascension was deeply shaped by the events following the Glorious Revolution of 1688. James II, Anne's father, had been deposed because of his Catholic faith and perceived attempts to establish an absolutist monarchy. In his place, Parliament had offered the crown jointly to Anne's sister, Mary II, and her husband, William III of Orange. Their reign was characterized by a necessary collaboration between the monarchy and Parliament, an arrangement that would set the tone for the constitutional monarchy that Anne would inherit. However, Mary's death in 1694, followed by William's reign alone, left a question of succession increasingly pressing, particularly as both William and Mary had no surviving children. In 1701, the Act of Settlement was passed by Parliament, an essential piece of legislation that played a decisive role in Anne's eventual accession. The Act established that the English throne would pass to the Protestant heirs of Sophia of Hanover, a granddaughter of James I, should Anne die without issue. The law explicitly excluded Catholics and anyone who married a Catholic from the line of succession, reflecting the deep religious divisions that continued to influence English politics. Though Anne herself was Protestant, her claim to the throne was secured by the Act, providing a legal foundation that silenced many of the doubts surrounding her right to rule. William III's declining health in the early 1700s created an atmosphere of expectancy and preparation for Anne's imminent accession. William had lost his wife and political partner, Mary II, and his popularity had waned. His policies, especially those concerning foreign wars and alliances, had alienated significant sections of the English political elite. While William's reign had reinforced the Protestant succession and curtailed the absolute powers of the monarchy, his foreignness and reliance on Dutch advisers made him less endearing to the English populace. Anne, in contrast, was seen as a true Englishwoman, devoted to the Church of England, familiar with English customs, and sympathetic to domestic concerns. This public perception significantly eased her transition to power when William III died on March 8, 1702. Anne's early political decisions reflected a combination of personal loyalty, political necessity, and religious conviction. Upon her accession, she immediately sought to heal the rifts that had developed between various factions during William's reign. She was determined to present herself as a monarch devoted to the welfare of her people and the stability of the kingdom. One of her first actions was to assure Parliament of her commitment to the Protestant faith and to maintaining the political settlement established after the Glorious Revolution. She famously declared that she knew her heart to be entirely English, a statement that resonated deeply with a public weary of foreign influence and instability. Anne's choice of advisers demonstrated her political astuteness, though her reliance on a small circle of trusted individuals would later become a source of controversy. Chief among her confidants was Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, whose husband, John Churchill, would become one of the greatest military commanders of the age. Anne's long-standing personal relationship with Sarah gave the Duchess considerable influence at court, though this intimacy would later prove both a blessing and a burden for the Queen. Politically, Anne initially favored the Tories, whose policies aligned more closely with her Anglican and conservative sympathies, though she would be forced to work with the Whigs as well, particularly as the demands of war required broader support. The immediate challenges Queen Anne faced upon her ascension were formidable. Foremost among these was the ongoing War of the Spanish Succession, a major conflict that drew England into a complex web of alliances against France and Spain. The war required significant financial resources, military leadership, and political unity, none of which could be taken for granted. Domestically, Anne had to manage a parliament divided between Tories and Whigs, each with their own agendas and visions for England's future. The Tories emphasized the maintenance of the Anglican Church and traditional hierarchies, while the Whigs advocated for the expansion of commercial interests and a more limited monarchy. Navigating these divisions demanded careful political maneuvering and personal diplomacy on Anne's part. Anne's coronation, held on April 23, 1702, was a grand event imbued with deep symbolic significance. The ceremony, conducted at Westminster Abbey, underscored her legitimacy and her commitment to the Protestant faith. Anne's physical presence, she was carried to the coronation because of her chronic health problems, elicited both sympathy and admiration. Despite her frailty, she projected an image of strength and dedication. Her choice of regalia, including St. Edward's crown and the scepter with the dove, further highlighted her continuity with English tradition and the sanctity of her rule. The symbolism of Anne's reign was particularly important given the political and religious tensions of the time. Her very person represented a bridge between the Stuart past and the constitutional present. She was, after all, the daughter of James II, the last Catholic king, yet she stood as a defender of Protestantism and parliamentary governance. This duality enabled her to appeal to a broad spectrum of the English population, uniting many who might otherwise have been divided. From the outset, Queen Anne's reign was marked by a conscious effort to distance herself from the unpopular aspects of William III's rule. She made a point of replacing many of William's Dutch advisers with English-born officials, thereby reinforcing her image as a national monarch rather than a foreign interloper. Her speeches to Parliament were carefully crafted to emphasize her piety, her devotion to her subjects, and her desire for peace and prosperity. Nevertheless, Anne was no mere figurehead. She took an active interest in matters of state, often corresponding directly with her ministers and making critical decisions about military and domestic policy. In her early years as queen, Anne also had to address the delicate matter of succession. Given her numerous personal tragedies, multiple miscarriages and the deaths of all her children in infancy or early childhood, there was a persistent anxiety about who would follow her on the throne. The Act of Settlement had designated the Electress Sophia of Hanover and her Protestant descendants as heirs, but many English subjects were uneasy about the prospect of another foreign dynasty. Anne's inability to produce an heir thus cast a long shadow over her reign, influencing political calculations and contributing to the persistent factionalism within Parliament. Despite these challenges, Anne's early reign saw notable successes. Under the leadership of John Churchill, now Duke of Marlborough, English forces achieved significant victories in the War of the Spanish Succession, boosting national pride and solidifying Anne's popularity. Domestically, the Queen supported measures to strengthen the Church of England and to promote economic growth. Her careful balancing of Tory and Whig interests, while never entirely satisfactory to either side, nonetheless enabled her to maintain a degree of political stability during a period that might easily have descended into renewed chaos. Anne's personal qualities, her piety, her sense of duty, and her emotional resilience, were crucial in enabling her to meet the formidable demands of queenship. Though often dismissed by later historians as a passive or ineffectual monarch, contemporary accounts reveal a woman deeply committed to her responsibilities and capable of significant political insight. Her personal correspondence, her management of court appointments, and her strategic use of patronage all attest to a queen who understood the levers of power and how to use them effectively. As the early years of Anne's reign unfolded, it became increasingly clear that her rule would leave a lasting impact on the political and cultural landscape of Britain. The symbolic significance of her reign extended beyond her own lifetime, laying the groundwork for the eventual unification of England and Scotland in 1707 and contributing to the development of the modern British state. Even in her early years on the throne, Queen Anne represented a stabilizing force at a time when the future of the monarchy, and indeed the nation itself, seemed far from secure. Queen Anne, often remembered as the last monarch of the House of Stuart, was a woman of complex character and deep personal convictions. Her personal qualities and temperament were deeply intertwined with her upbringing, health, religious devotion, and the intimate relationships she cultivated throughout her life. These aspects collectively shaped her reign and her legacy as a monarch, and was noted for her sincerity, modesty, and strong sense of duty. She lacked the flamboyance of some of her predecessors but made up for it with a determined and often stubborn spirit. Though she was not highly intellectual or eloquent, she possessed a solid practical understanding of politics and a keen intuition for people's characters. Her emotional nature sometimes led to accusations of being easily influenced, but it also meant she formed deep, lasting loyalties, and could be both warm and reserved, displaying a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. Her gentleness and preference for a quiet domestic life made her endearing to many of her subjects, but it also caused her to struggle with the public and political demands of monarchy. Religion played an essential role in Anne's life and fundamentally shaped her worldview. A devout Anglican, Anne was fervently committed to the Church of England, viewing it as a cornerstone of both personal salvation and national stability. Her religious faith was not merely ceremonial but deeply personal and heartfelt. She believed strongly in divine providence and often interpreted events in her life and reign through a theological lens. Her support for the Church of England was a significant element of her political policies, including her endorsement of the Occasional Conformity Act and other measures designed to limit the influence of Catholics and Protestant dissenters. Anne's faith was also a source of comfort during her numerous personal trials, providing her with a framework for understanding and enduring her many losses and disappointments. Anne's relationships with her family were complex and often marked by tragedy and strained dynamics. Her bond with her mother and Hyde was strong, but their time together was brief, as her mother died when Anne was still young. The early loss of her mother likely contributed to Anne's attachment to maternal figures throughout her life. Her relationship with her father, James II, was more complicated, particularly after his conversion to Catholicism, and remained loyal to him personally but distanced herself politically, aligning with the Protestant cause during the Glorious Revolution. Her relationship with her sister, Mary II, was initially close, but political tensions and personal misunderstandings strained their bond after Mary and her husband, William III, ascended the throne, and felt sidelined and humiliated by William and Mary, particularly regarding her place in the royal succession and her financial independence. These familial tensions left Anne feeling isolated and embittered, further deepening her reliance on close confidants outside her immediate family. Anne's health struggles were a defining feature of her life. She suffered from a range of chronic illnesses, including gout, rheumatoid arthritis, and dropsy. Her health began to decline early in adulthood and worsened over time, ultimately rendering her severely obese and often incapacitated. Her physical suffering was compounded by repeated personal tragedies. She endured at least 17 pregnancies, none of which resulted in a child surviving to adulthood. These losses took a profound emotional toll on Anne, contributing to bouts of depression and further weakening her already fragile health. Despite her physical limitations, Anne maintained a strong sense of duty and continued to fulfill her royal obligations as best she could, though her declining health increasingly curtailed her ability to participate actively in governance and public life. Within her court, Anne's relationships were characterized by intense personal attachments and frequent political rivalries. She relied heavily on a small circle of trusted confidants, most notably Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Anne and Sarah's friendship began in their youth and grew into a deeply affectionate and influential relationship. Sarah's strong personality and political ambitions often dominated their interactions, leading to tension as Anne sought to assert her independence. Over time, their friendship deteriorated, with Anne growing weary of Sarah's domineering behavior. The subsequent rise of Abigail Masham, a cousin of Sarah Churchill, marked a shift in Anne's court dynamics. Abigail's gentler demeanor appealed to Anne's desire for loyalty and personal comfort, and her influence grew as Sarah's waned. These relationships illustrate Anne's need for emotional support and her vulnerability to being swayed by those she trusted, a trait that shaped both her personal life and political decisions. Anne's personal correspondence offers a revealing glimpse into her character. Her letters are marked by an earnest, heartfelt tone and a tendency toward emotional expression. In her letters to Sarah Churchill, Anne frequently expressed her deep affection and reliance, using language that reflected both genuine intimacy and a yearning for unwavering loyalty. Even as their relationship became strained, Anne's letters reveal a struggle to reconcile her need for emotional support with her growing resentment towards Sarah's perceived manipulations. Her correspondence with Abigail Masham, though less voluminous, similarly reflects Anne's desire for sincere and uncomplicated relationships. Beyond her personal attachments, Anne's letters also reveal her deep concern for the welfare of her country, her commitment to her religious principles, and her sense of responsibility as queen. Taken together, these aspects of Queen Anne's character and personality paint a portrait of a woman who was deeply human in her strengths and vulnerabilities. Her personal qualities, sincerity, modesty, emotional depth, and resilience, shaped her approach to monarchy and her interactions with those around her. Her devout Anglican faith provided her with a guiding framework amid personal and political challenges. Her familial relationships, marked by loyalty, loss, and tension, profoundly affected her emotional landscape. Her chronic health issues not only caused physical suffering but also influenced her political conduct and courtly life. The dynamics of her court, dominated by shifting alliances and personal affections, underscored her need for companionship and loyalty. Finally, her personal correspondence serves as a testament to her heartfelt nature, revealing a queen who, despite her many burdens, strove to fulfill her role with dedication and humanity. Steadfastness, sincerity, emotional depth, and sense of duty were both her greatest assets and her greatest challenges as a ruler. Her devout Anglican faith provided her with moral clarity and personal comfort, but also limited her ability to bridge religious divides. Her family relationships were marred by loss, political conflict, and emotional wounds that never fully healed. Her chronic health issues profoundly shaped her life, forcing her to balance personal suffering with the responsibilities of monarchy. Anne's relationships within her court and her reliance on close confidants highlight her need for emotional support and her susceptibility to personal influence, while her correspondence offers a candid and often poignant view of her inner life. Queen Anne's reign may have lacked the dramatic flair of some of her predecessors, but her character and personality left an indelible mark on the monarchy and the nation she served. Her humanity, her trials, and her perseverance under immense personal and political pressure continue to evoke empathy and respect centuries later. When Queen Anne ascended the throne in 1702, she inherited a deeply divided political landscape shaped by the rivalry between two dominant factions, the Whigs and the Tories. This division permeated every aspect of her reign and significantly influenced the governance of the kingdom. The Whigs were broadly supportive of constitutional monarchy, religious tolerance for dissenters, and the interests of the emerging commercial class. The Tories, on the other hand, championed the Anglican Church, traditional monarchy, and the landed gentry. Anne, a devout Anglican and naturally inclined towards Tory principles, found herself constantly balancing the competing demands of these two factions, with profound implications for her rule. Central to the political dynamics of Anne's reign were her key ministers, particularly Robert Harley and Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke. Robert Harley, initially a Whig who later leaned Tory, proved to be a masterful political operator. As Speaker of the House of Commons and later as Secretary of State and Earl of Oxford, Harley was adept at managing the shifting alliances at court and in Parliament. His ability to maneuver between factions made him an indispensable advisor to Anne, especially as her distrust of the Whigs grew. Viscount Bolingbroke, a brilliant but ambitious politician, emerged later as a key figure in Tory politics, advocating for peace with France and the strengthening of royal authority. Their careers and the rivalry between them encapsulated the turbulent political environment of Anne's reign. Equally significant was the role of Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, whose friendship with and had begun during their youth. Sarah's influence over Anne was immense, and she leveraged this closeness to advance Whig interests. As mistress of the robes and keeper of the privy purse, Sarah held enormous sway over court appointments and patronage, further entrenching Whig dominance in the early years of Anne's rule. However, Sarah's overbearing personality and political ambitions eventually strained her relationship with the Queen, culminating in a dramatic and bitter fallout that mirrored the shifting tides of political favor at court. The use of patronage was a critical tool for maintaining political loyalty and stability during Anne's reign. Court appointments, pensions, and honors were dispensed strategically to secure support from members of Parliament and influential aristocrats. Patronage was not merely a means of rewarding loyalty, it was an essential mechanism for governing a fractious political environment. However, the distribution of patronage also fueled resentment and competition, contributing to the instability that characterized much of Anne's rule. A major issue that loomed over Anne's reign was the question of succession. The Act of Settlement of 1701, passed during the reign of William III, stipulated that the English crown would pass to the Protestant House of Hanover upon Anne's death, bypassing numerous Catholic claimants. Anne, who had suffered numerous personal tragedies, including the loss of all her children, had no surviving heirs. The succession question thus remained a source of anxiety and political maneuvering throughout her reign. Many Tories were ambivalent about the Hanoverian succession, preferring a return to a Stuart monarch, while the Whigs staunchly defended the Protestant succession as essential to the preservation of constitutional monarchy and religious liberty. The Hanoverian succession had profound implications for Anne's reign. It influenced alliances, shaped legislative agendas, and heightened tensions between the Queen and her ministers. While Anne publicly supported the Act of Settlement, her private sentiments were more complex. She harbored reservations about the Hanoverians and maintained a degree of sympathy for her exiled relatives. This ambivalence often placed her at odds with the Whigs, who viewed any wavering on the succession as a threat to the stability of the realm. The power dynamics between Queen and her ministers were marked by tension and negotiation. And, though determined to exercise her royal prerogative, was often constrained by the realities of parliamentary governance. The royal prerogative theoretically endowed the monarch with considerable powers, including the right to appoint ministers, summon and dissolve parliament, and direct foreign policy. In practice, however, Anne's authority was limited by the need for parliamentary support, particularly for funding military campaigns such as the War of the Spanish Succession. Anne's reliance on her ministers, coupled with her personal inclinations, meant that political power often resided with those who could command the confidence of both the Queen and Parliament. The fluidity of party allegiances, the need for coalition building, and the influence of court factions further diluted Anne's personal control over governance. Nevertheless, Anne was not a passive monarch. She skillfully navigated political rivalries, occasionally dismissing ministers who lost her confidence or who she perceived as threats to her authority. Her dismissal of the Whig junto and her eventual reliance on Harley and Bolingbroke demonstrate her willingness to assert her prerogatives when necessary. The concept of royal prerogative was thus both a source of authority and a point of contention during Anne's reign. While Anne cherished her rights as sovereign, she understood the necessity of compromise in an age when parliamentary power was growing. Her reign, therefore, exemplifies the gradual transition from the personal rule of monarchs to a system of constitutional monarchy in which the sovereign reigned but did not govern independently. The interplay between personal relationships and political power was a defining feature of Anne's reign. The breakdown of her friendship with Sarah Churchill, the rise of Abigail Massam as her new favorite, and the shifting loyalties at court all had significant political ramifications. Sarah's replacement by Massam, who aligned with Tory interests, facilitated the resurgence of Tory influence in the later years of Anne's reign. This realignment was crucial in the negotiation of the Treaty of Utrecht, which ended Britain's involvement in the War of the Spanish Succession and marked a major triumph for Tory policy. The political landscape of Anne's reign was further complicated by the broader European context. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, dominated much of her reign and required extensive cooperation between the Crown and Parliament. The war effort necessitated heavy taxation, national debt, and the expansion of government institutions, developments that had long-term consequences for British politics and society. The management of the war, the negotiation of peace, and the distribution of spoils became highly politicized issues, fueling the rivalry between Whigs and Tories and influencing the course of Anne's domestic policies. Despite the challenges, Anne's reign witnessed significant achievements. The Act of Union in 1707, which unified England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain, was a landmark accomplishment with lasting impact. Though motivated in part by security concerns and economic incentives, the union reflected Anne's personal commitment to strengthening her realm. The political negotiations that led to the union required deft handling of competing interests, and Anne's role, though often behind the scenes, was instrumental in securing the agreement. Anne's ability to maintain relative stability during a period of intense factionalism, war, and constitutional change speaks to her political acumen and resilience. She was a monarch who, despite personal frailties and political limitations, managed to uphold the dignity of the crown and navigate her kingdom through a transformative era. Her reign marked the end of the Stuart dynasty and the beginning of the Hanoverian era, a transition that would shape the future of the British monarchy. In conclusion, the politics of Queen Anne's reign were characterized by deep factional divisions, the rise and fall of powerful ministers, the strategic use of patronage, the contentious issue of succession, and the gradual evolution of constitutional monarchy. Anne's personal qualities, political instincts, and commitment to her role enabled her to steer the monarchy through a period of profound change. Her reign stands as a testament to the complexities of governance in an age when personal loyalty, political principle, and the demands of an emerging modern state intersected in ways that would define the course of British history. When Queen Anne ascended the throne in 1702, she inherited a kingdom deeply fractured along political lines. The two dominant factions of the era, the Whigs and the Tories, represented far more than mere political differences. They embodied competing visions of monarchy, religion, and governance. The Whigs broadly supported constitutional monarchy, religious tolerance for Protestant dissenters, and the interests of the growing commercial classes, particularly those involved in banking and trade. In contrast, the Tories championed the traditional Anglican establishment, hereditary monarchy, and the landed aristocracy. Anne herself, a devout Anglican with deeply traditional views, instinctively leaned toward the Tories. However, the necessity of maintaining parliamentary support meant that she could not afford to govern with a single faction alone. Throughout her reign, the competition between Whigs and Tories would profoundly influence policy, ministerial appointments, and even the Queen's personal relationships. Anne's reign cannot be understood without examining the towering figures of Robert Harley and Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke. Robert Harley began his political career as a moderate Whig but gradually moved toward Toryism, especially as the rigid demands of the Whig junto began to alienate the Queen. Harley's skill lay in his extraordinary adaptability and mastery of political intrigue. Serving first as Speaker of the House of Commons, he became Secretary of State for the Northern Department, and later rose to the title of Earl of Oxford. Harley cultivated a network of supporters in both houses of Parliament and used his influence to shield the Queen from the overbearing demands of any single faction. His careful balancing act allowed Anne to navigate the treacherous waters of factional politics for much of her reign. Viscount Bolingbroke, a brilliant and ambitious figure, rose to prominence under Harley's mentorship but soon proved a force in his own right. Bolingbroke had a vision of a more active and influential monarchy, one that could rise above the factional squabbles of Parliament. His later career was marked by a desire to craft a Tory political philosophy that could outlast the Queen's reign. Bolingbroke's talents in oratory and writing made him a formidable political force, though his ambition and tendency toward intrigue eventually sowed discord between him and Harley. The private and political spheres were never clearly separated at Anne's court, and few relationships illustrate this more vividly than Anne's bond with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. The friendship between Anne and Sarah stretched back to their youth, and for many years, Sarah was Anne's closest confidant. In the early part of Anne's reign, Sarah used her influence to promote the Whigs, particularly her husband, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, who commanded English forces during the War of the Spanish Succession. Sarah's positions at court, including Mistress of the Robes and Keeper of the Privy Purse, gave her immense control over court patronage. Through her, many Whig allies secured positions of influence. However, Sarah's domineering personality, combined with her political ambitions, ultimately wore on the Queen. Over time, Anne's irritation with Sarah's overfamiliarity and political hectoring grew into resentment, culminating in a dramatic break between the two. Sarah's replacement by Abigail Massam, a more pliable cousin, marked a significant shift in the political landscape, as Harley and the Tories gained greater influence at court. Patronage was an essential mechanism by which political loyalty was secured during Anne's reign. Control over appointments to lucrative offices, titles, pensions, and even ceremonial roles allowed the monarch and her ministers to reward allies and punish dissenters. And, though often portrayed as politically passive, was deeply involved in the distribution of patronage. She understood that favoring one faction too heavily could provoke rebellion in Parliament, while alienating too many powerful families could destabilize her reign. Consequently, the politics of patronage were carefully managed, though not always successfully. The intense competition for royal favor exacerbated tensions between Whigs and Tories, as both sides sought to position their supporters advantageously. The question of succession haunted Anne's reign almost from its beginning. The death of all 17 of her children, none surviving infancy, meant that the future of the monarchy was uncertain. The Act of Settlement of 1701 had designated the Protestant House of Hanover as Anne's successors, bypassing the closer Catholic descendants of James II. This legislation was intended to ensure that England remained a Protestant kingdom, but it was controversial. Many Tories harbored Jacobite sympathies and favored the Stuart line's restoration. Anne's personal feelings about the succession were complicated. Though she accepted the Hanoverian succession officially, she showed little personal enthusiasm for it, and there were persistent rumors that she considered alternative plans. The Hanoverian question injected a note of urgency and tension into every political dispute during Anne's reign. The Whigs, identifying themselves as the guardians of the Protestant succession, used the threat of Jacobitism to justify their demands for greater influence. Conversely, some Tories advocated for a less aggressive approach, arguing for reconciliation or at least a more ambiguous stance toward the exiled Stuarts. The underlying issue was not merely religious but deeply political. Whoever controlled the succession would shape the future of the English constitution. Anne's ministers had to tread carefully, reassuring Parliament and foreign allies while navigating the Queen's own ambivalence. Tensions between Anne and her ministers were a recurring theme throughout her reign. Anne believed deeply in the divine right of kings and the sacred nature of her office. She expected her ministers to serve her loyally and defer to her wishes. However, the realities of governing in an increasingly constitutional framework often forced compromises that Anne found distasteful. Ministers needed the support of Parliament to secure funding for wars and domestic programs. Thus, Anne's choices were frequently constrained by political necessity. When her personal preferences clashed with parliamentary opinion, she sometimes found herself compelled to dismiss favored advisers or accept ministers she personally disliked. The conflict over the War of the Spanish Succession provides a vivid example of these tensions. Initially prosecuted vigorously under Marlborough's leadership, the war's immense cost and uncertain objectives eventually led to widespread public discontent. Harley and Bolingbroke capitalized on this sentiment, promoting a policy of peace, and, weary of the war and eager to reduce the strain on her realm, supported their efforts to negotiate the Treaty of Utrecht. The decision to end the war, despite Whig opposition, demonstrated Anne's ability to assert her will, but it also highlighted the fragile nature of her political support. The concept of royal privilege, so central to earlier Stuart monarchs, had been significantly curtailed by the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the subsequent Bill of Rights, and retained important privilege powers. She could appoint ministers, summon and dissolve Parliament, and conduct foreign affairs. However, the use of these powers was subject to increasing scrutiny. Ministers needed the confidence of Parliament to be effective, and the financial demands of government necessitated parliamentary grants. Anne's personal preferences could shape policy, but they could not override political realities. Nonetheless, Anne was neither a puppet nor a figurehead. She exercised her powers with determination, if sometimes with less political finesse than her predecessor, William III. Her dismissals of ministers who displeased her, including the Whig junto and later even Harley himself, show that she was willing to act decisively when necessary. Yet, each such act had to be carefully calculated, for an alienated Parliament could bring governance to a standstill. Anne's reign thus exemplifies the gradual shift from monarchical government to parliamentary monarchy, where the sovereign reigned but effective power increasingly lay in the hands of ministers and elected representatives. The deterioration of Anne's health further complicated the political scene in her later years. Suffering from gout, obesity, and other ailments, Anne's ability to attend to the demands of government declined. This physical weakness encouraged ministers and courtiers to maneuver even more aggressively for influence. Bolingbroke, ambitious and impatient, sought to dominate policy and even hinted at restoring a Stuart monarchy under certain conditions. Harley, more cautious and pragmatic, tried to maintain a balance. Their rivalry, fueled by personal ambition and differing visions of the monarchy's future, culminated in political paralysis. The final years of Anne's reign were marked by intrigue, factionalism, and uncertainty. As her health worsened, questions about the succession became more urgent. The Whigs, sensing an opportunity, rallied to ensure a smooth transition to the House of Hanover. Tories, divided among themselves, were less effective. When Anne died in August 1714, the political groundwork laid by the Whigs ensured that George I of Hanover ascended the throne without significant opposition. Yet, the transition was not the result of Anne's active planning, but rather the culmination of broader political forces that had gradually eroded the traditional powers of the monarchy. Anne's reign, often overshadowed by the more dramatic figures who came before and after her, marked a crucial turning point in British history. The fierce competition between Whigs and Tories during her rule helped to institutionalize party politics. The role of ministers evolved from mere advisors to effective heads of government accountable not only to the monarch but also to Parliament. Patronage remained a potent political tool, but it increasingly served parliamentary majorities rather than the personal whims of the sovereign. The settlement of the Hanoverian succession ensured that Britain would remain Protestant, but it also further entrenched parliamentary supremacy. Above all, Anne's reign exemplified the delicate balancing act required of a monarch in an age of constitutional transformation. Her struggles with ministers, factions, and the limitations of her own power revealed both the enduring prestige of monarchy and its gradual accommodation to a new political reality. And herself, deeply pious, personally reserved, and politically cautious, never aspired to be a revolutionary figure. Yet by the time of her death, the office she held had changed irrevocably. The monarchy had survived, but it had been reshaped by forces larger than any individual sovereign. In many ways, Anne's reign laid the foundations for the modern British political system. The emergence of a cabinet government, the solidification of political parties, the increased importance of parliamentary control over finances and foreign policy, and the clarification of the limits of royal prerogative were all legacies of her time on the throne. Though often overlooked, Queen Anne presided over one of the most consequential periods of political evolution in British history, not through grand acts of reform, but through the daily realities of managing a kingdom in the midst of profound change. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714, was one of the most significant and wide-ranging conflicts of Queen Anne's reign, touching nearly every aspect of British life: political, military, economic, and even cultural. It was a war fought not merely over who would sit on the Spanish throne, but over the balance of power in Europe itself. At its heart was the fear that France, under the rule of Louis XIV, would unite with Spain to create a single massive empire that would dominate the continent and threaten the independence of other European powers, including Britain. The death of the childless Charles II of Spain had triggered a scramble among the European dynasties, each anxious to prevent such a powerful union. Although the Bourbon Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, had been named heir, his acceptance raised the alarming prospect of French-Spanish dominance. Queen Anne, newly ascended to the English throne in 1702, inherited the early stages of this crisis. Almost immediately, her government committed England to a coalition of powers that included the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic, and various German and Italian states. England's entry into the war was motivated by both fear and opportunity. Fear of French hegemony and the opportunity to secure maritime and colonial advantages. Queen Anne, though not personally a military strategist, played a vital role in supporting the war politically and sustaining alliances through deft management of her court and parliament. The conflict unfolded on multiple fronts, across Europe, in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, and even in distant colonies. However, the central theater of war for Britain was the European continent, where English and Allied forces sought to prevent the consolidation of Bourbon power. Central to Britain's military successes was John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, a brilliant general whose campaigns would become legendary. Marlborough was not only a military commander but also a statesman, negotiating with allies, maintaining the fragile coalition, and ensuring that Britain's strategic goals remained at the forefront of the Allied agenda. Marlborough's victories were spectacular and instrumental in keeping the alliance together. The Battle of Blenheim in 1704 was a pivotal moment. Facing the threat of a French and Bavarian army poised to overrun Vienna, Marlborough led a daring and brilliantly executed attack that resulted in a decisive victory. This triumph saved the Habsburg monarchy and prevented France from achieving early dominance. Blenheim was followed by further successes, including the battles of Ramillies in 1706, Oudenarde in 1708, and Malplaquet in 1709. These victories showcased not just Marlborough's tactical genius but also his ability to coordinate multinational forces, a feat of diplomacy as much as of military science. Yet the war was as much a political struggle at home as it was a military contest abroad. Funding a protracted continental war required heavy taxation and borrowing, straining England's finances and stirring political controversy. The Whigs, who generally supported the war effort, saw it as a necessary means of securing Britain's place as a great power and protecting Protestant Europe. The Tories, more skeptical of foreign entanglements, increasingly called for peace as the war dragged on. Queen Anne, though a committed supporter of the Protestant cause, grew weary of the war's costs and the political friction it caused within her own government. Anne's relationship with Marlborough, once warm and trusting, deteriorated over the course of the conflict. Partly, this was due to the growing influence of Abigail Masham, who supplanted Sarah Churchill, Marlborough's wife, as Anne's closest confidant. But it was also rooted in deeper political shifts. Marlborough, aligned with the Whigs, increasingly found himself at odds with a queen who, by temperament and political instinct, leaned toward the Tories. His vast personal power and occasional political overreach began to alarm Anne, who was determined to reassert royal authority. By 1711, Anne had dismissed Marlborough from all his offices, a stunning fall from grace for a man who had once been the undisputed hero of the realm. The broader impact of the war on Anne's reign was profound. Domestically, the war reshaped the British economy, accelerating the growth of national debt and strengthening the financial institutions, like the Bank of England, that managed it. The need to fund the war also expanded government bureaucracy and increased the size and influence of Parliament, changes that would have lasting consequences for the British state. Politically, the war intensified factionalism. The Whigs became increasingly associated with the idea of a war party, eager to prolong the conflict to secure imperial advantages, while the Tories positioned themselves as the champions of peace and the defenders of traditional English liberties against the encroachments of centralized government. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, formally ended Britain's participation in the war and secured significant advantages for the kingdom. Britain recognized Philip V as King of Spain, thereby acknowledging the Bourbon succession, but crucially obtained assurances that the thrones of France and Spain would never be united. In territorial terms, Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca, important strategic outposts in the Mediterranean, and acquired valuable commercial rights, including the Asiento, a monopoly on the slave trade to Spanish America. These gains laid the foundation for Britain's rise as a global maritime power in the 18th century. Yet the Treaty of Utrecht was controversial and deeply divisive. Many Whigs condemned it as a betrayal of the war's original aims. They argued that the settlement left France too strong and sacrificed the legitimate rights of the Austrian Habsburgs to the Spanish throne. Tories, on the other hand, celebrated it as a necessary and honorable peace that secured British interests without bankrupting the kingdom. Public opinion was similarly divided. Although many ordinary Britons, weary after more than a decade of war, welcomed peace, others, especially among the merchant classes and the more fervent Protestants, worried that the treaty represented a retreat in the face of Catholic absolutism. The political fallout from the treaty and the broader conduct of the war was immediate and severe. The fall of the Whigs from power, orchestrated by Anne's Tory ministers such as Robert Harley and Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke, reshaped British politics. The Whigs would not return to government until after Anne's death, when the accession of George I ushered in a long period of Whig dominance. For and personally, the war years were deeply stressful and ultimately isolating. The loss of close friends, the constant political maneuvering, and the burden of supporting a protracted conflict took a heavy toll on her health and spirits. By the end of her reign, Anne was physically broken, emotionally exhausted, and increasingly dependent on a narrow circle of trusted advisors. The war had secured Britain's place among the great powers of Europe, but it had also exposed the limits of monarchical authority in a modernizing state. Anne's efforts to assert her will against the rising power of Parliament met with only partial success. The age of absolute monarchy was clearly drawing to a close. Nonetheless, Anne's reign, and particularly her role during the War of the Spanish Succession, left an indelible mark on British history. The victories won on European battlefields, the alliances forged and maintained, and the treaties negotiated at the conference tables of Europe all contributed to Britain's emergence as a major international power. The institutions strengthened during the war, the army, the navy, the financial system, and even the culture of parliamentary debate, would form the backbone of Britain's imperial expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries. The War of the Spanish Succession was thus not merely a dynastic dispute or a series of military campaigns. It was a transformative event for Britain. It redefined the country's political landscape, reshaped its economy, and reoriented its place in the world. Queen Anne, often underestimated by historians, played a crucial role in this transformation. Though she was not a warrior queen in the mold of Elizabeth I, Anne's steadfastness, political acumen, and personal resilience during a time of intense domestic and international pressure were central to Britain's successes. Even the cultural life of Britain was affected by the war. Celebrations of Marlborough's victories, like the construction of Blenheim Palace, served as public monuments to military glory and national pride. Literature, pamphlets, and political satire flourished, as public debate about the war's conduct and consequences reached unprecedented levels. Figures like Jonathan Swift, a Tory sympathizer, used their pens to shape public opinion, criticizing the war and championing peace. These debates contributed to a broader political awakening among the British public, laying the groundwork for a more participatory political culture. In retrospect, the War of the Spanish Succession can be seen as a testing ground for Britain's future. It revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the country's political system, the capabilities of its military and financial institutions, and the complexities of maintaining a global strategy. The lessons learned during these years would be applied in later conflicts, from the 7 Years' War to the Napoleonic Wars, as Britain increasingly projected its power far beyond its shores. The war also demonstrated the potential dangers of unchecked factionalism. The intense rivalries between Whigs and Tories, exacerbated by the pressures of war, highlighted the need for a more stable and inclusive political system. In the decades following Anne's death, British politics would gradually evolve toward greater moderation and pragmatism, partly in response to the divisive experiences of her reign. Ultimately, Queen Anne's legacy, and the legacy of the War of the Spanish Succession, was a Britain that had begun to imagine itself not merely as a European power, but as a global one. The sacrifices and struggles of the war years were immense, but they paved the way for the British Empire's future growth. And herself, in her quiet and often understated way, had presided over one of the most important transitions in British history, a transition from a relatively insular kingdom to a burgeoning world power. Though her reign ended in personal sorrow and physical decline, the broader historical trajectory she helped to shape was one of expansion, ambition, and profound transformation. Of all Queen Anne's relationships, none proved as formative, and ultimately as destructive, as her bond with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Their connection was deep, originating long before Anne ascended the throne, blossoming in their youth when Anne was a princess and Sarah, with her strong-willed personality and captivating charm, offered Anne the affection and guidance she craved. Anne, shy, physically frail, and often isolated at court, leaned heavily on Sarah, who became not just a friend but a confidant, a protector, and an advisor. Sarah's wit, intelligence, and ambition were evident early on, and she wielded her influence over and with a mixture of affection and a calculated sense of power. In Anne's eyes, Sarah was a dazzling figure of strength. In Sarah's view, Anne was someone to be both cherished and guided, sometimes forcefully, toward what Sarah believed were the right political and personal decisions. When Anne became queen in 1702, Sarah's influence grew to unprecedented levels. Appointed to several key positions within the royal household, including Mistress of the Robes, Keeper of the Privy Purse, and Groom of the Stole, Sarah essentially had unparalleled access to the monarch. This proximity to the Queen allowed Sarah to influence not only Anne's personal life, but also the politics of the realm. At a time when the line between the personal and the political was exceptionally thin, Sarah's role at court became synonymous with power itself. Her Whig sympathies shaped her advice to Anne, pushing the Queen toward supporting the War of the Spanish Succession and maintaining alliances with Whig leaders. Sarah's close connection to her husband, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, whose military prowess during the war bolstered the Queen's and Britain's international standing, further cemented her authority. Yet the very traits that made Sarah so effective also sowed the seeds of her downfall. Her confidence often bordered on arrogance, and her tendency to speak to and with bluntness and even condescension began to wear thin. And, while outwardly passive, was not without pride or a sense of her own dignity. As queen, she expected a certain level of deference that Sarah increasingly failed to provide. What began as affectionate banter between friends grew into a pattern of tension, with Sarah issuing demands and criticisms that Anne, over time, came to resent deeply. Compounding the strain was Sarah's insistence on promoting Whig interests even when Anne's sympathies began to lean more towards the Tories, who were gaining ground by the mid-1700s. Anne's religious sensibilities, firmly Anglican and High Church, clashed with the more latitudinarian Whig views that Sarah supported. As the war dragged on, public fatigue grew, and increasingly saw the Whigs and, by extension, Sarah's influence, as impediments to peace and stability. Meanwhile, Sarah, used to commanding Anne's loyalty and attention, could not adapt to the Queen's evolving political stance or her growing desire for independence. Into this widening chasm stepped Abigail Masham, a cousin of Sarah's, who began to displace the Duchess in Anne's affections. Unlike Sarah, Abigail was gentle, deferential, and careful never to overstep her bounds. Her presence at court offered Anne the emotional comfort she once found in Sarah, but without the hectoring tone. Sarah viewed Abigail's rise with a mixture of fury and disbelief, believing that she alone had the right to Anne's confidence and that Abigail was merely a pawn of Tory interests. The rivalry between Sarah and Abigail became emblematic of the broader political struggles at court. Whigs versus Tories, war versus peace, assertive guidance versus submissive companionship. The final rupture between Anne and Sarah came after a series of increasingly public and humiliating confrontations. Sarah's insistence on political appointments, her scornful attitude toward Abigail, and her disrespectful behavior toward the Queen herself culminated in a disastrous argument during a church service in 1710, when Sarah allegedly instructed Anne to be quick, in a manner more befitting a servant than a sovereign. Such an affront could not be easily forgiven. And, weary of Sarah's domineering presence and emboldened by her new Tory allies, moved decisively to distance herself. In 1711, and orchestrated Sarah's formal removal from court. The Duchess was stripped of her offices and dismissed from the Queen's presence. It was a profound fall from grace for someone who had once wielded near absolute influence over the monarch. Sarah's removal had wide-ranging consequences. Politically, it signaled a decisive shift towards Tory dominance, culminating in the negotiations for the Treaty of Utrecht, which brought an end to the War of the Spanish Succession. Personally, it marked Anne's assertion of independence, a late-blooming but significant claim to her own agency as a ruler. The role of personal loyalty and betrayal in Anne's governance cannot be overstated. The Queen's political decisions were often filtered through the prism of her personal relationships, and her reliance on trusted companions like Sarah Churchill, followed by her later reliance on Abigail Masham, reveals just how deeply emotional bonds influenced matters of state. Anne was not a cold, detached ruler. She was profoundly human, governed by her need for affection, loyalty, and respect. When those needs were met, her trust was unwavering. When they were violated, her retribution was absolute. Sarah Churchill's fall illuminates not only the fragility of court favor but also the precarious balance between personal affinity and political pragmatism. For years, Sarah's forceful character had driven Anne's support for the Whigs and Britain's aggressive foreign policy. Yet when Sarah's personal abrasiveness outweighed her political usefulness, Anne was willing, and perhaps eager, to replace her. The Queen's final years were marked by a growing preference for moderation and peace, goals that her Tory ministers, and her new confidant Abigail, were better positioned to achieve. Sarah, for her part, never forgave Anne for what she saw as a betrayal. After her dismissal, she embarked on a campaign to salvage her reputation and to vilify those she believed had poisoned and against her. Her memoirs present a self-portrait of loyalty wronged and political wisdom disregarded, though history often reads them as the embittered writings of someone who had flown too close to the sun. Nevertheless, Sarah's contributions to the politics of Anne's reign were undeniable. Her ability to mobilize support for the war, to bolster her husband's military endeavors, and to shape the ideological contours of the court left a lasting mark. In the end, the relationship between Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill stands as a dramatic testament to the entanglement of personal emotion and political power. Their bond, once the axis around which Anne's early reign revolved, ultimately collapsed under the weight of ambition, pride, and shifting allegiances. It is a story of intimacy turned rivalry, of loyalty tested and found wanting, and of a queen who, in asserting her independence, had to sacrifice the relationship that had once defined her. The early 18th century was a time of tremendous political complexity and transformation in the British Isles. One of the most defining events of Queen Anne's reign was the union of England and Scotland in 1707, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. The political climate leading up to the Act of Union was fraught with tension, economic concerns, and deep-seated mistrust between the two nations. Following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which had placed William III and Mary II on the throne, the question of succession remained unresolved and contentious, especially after the death of William and the childlessness of Queen Anne. England, keen to secure a Protestant succession, passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, designating the House of Hanover as the next in line. However, Scotland was not bound by this decision and passed its own Act of Security in 1704, asserting its right to choose a different successor. This divergence threatened political stability and raised the spectre of a divided monarchy. Economically, Scotland was reeling from the catastrophic failure of the Darien scheme, an ambitious but disastrous attempt to establish a Scottish colony in Panama. The financial ruin that followed left Scotland vulnerable and in desperate need of economic security. England, meanwhile, was deeply concerned about the possibility of Scotland aligning with France, their perennial enemy. The prospect of a hostile Scotland sharing the same island was unacceptable to English policymakers. Thus, the motivations for union were rooted in both nations' needs. England sought security and political unity, while Scotland sought economic relief and stability. Queen Anne's support for the union was pivotal. Personally committed to the Protestant cause and deeply aware of the need for a stable succession, she recognized that a united Britain would be stronger, more secure, and better positioned to thrive in a competitive European landscape. Anne's motivations were both ideological and pragmatic. She believed in the unity of her subjects under one crown and one parliament. Her own experience of political instability and religious conflict made her particularly sensitive to the dangers of disunity. Furthermore, Anne's reign was characterized by an overarching desire to strengthen and centralize royal authority, and the union would solidify her legacy as a monarch who had unified her realms. The complexities of achieving union with Scotland were immense. Opposition was fierce and widespread. Many Scots viewed the proposed union as a surrender of their national sovereignty and identity. There were fears that Scotland would become a mere province of England, losing its distinct legal, religious, and educational systems. Negotiations were arduous, marked by deep distrust and competing interests. The Scottish Parliament was reluctant to cede authority, while English negotiators were determined to secure a union that would safeguard English interests. Compromises were necessary. The Treaty of Union, finalized in 1706, guaranteed the preservation of the Church of Scotland, Scottish law, and Scottish educational institutions. Economic concessions were also made, including the infamous equivalent, a sum of money paid to Scotland to offset the debts incurred from the Darien disaster and to compensate for the higher taxes Scots would pay under the new regime. Queen Anne played a crucial role in facilitating the union. Though she did not involve herself in the day-to-day negotiations, her influence was felt throughout the process. She appointed commissioners she trusted to negotiate on behalf of England and worked to ensure that her Scottish advisers were aligned with her objectives. Anne's consistent support for the union, expressed in her speeches and correspondence, signaled to both parliaments that she viewed the union as a matter of utmost importance. Her personal commitment lent the project legitimacy and urgency. Moreover, Anne adeptly navigated the political factions at court, balancing the interests of Whigs and Tories to maintain momentum for the union. The passage of the Act of Union in 1707 had profound implications for Britain's future. It created a single kingdom under one monarch and one parliament, based in Westminster. The union laid the foundation for the emergence of Britain as a major global power. By combining the resources, manpower, and economies of England and Scotland, the union strengthened Britain's ability to compete on the international stage, particularly against France and Spain. It also established the framework for the expansion of the British Empire, as Scottish talent and enterprise played crucial roles in Britain's imperial ventures. However, the union was not universally celebrated. Public reaction, particularly in Scotland, was deeply ambivalent, if not outright hostile. Riots broke out in several Scottish cities. Many Scots felt betrayed by their own elite, who were seen as having sold out national sovereignty for personal gain. The Scottish Parliament had been dissolved, and many ordinary Scots mourned the loss of their independent legislature. The sense of alienation and resentment would simmer for generations, fueling movements for greater autonomy and, eventually, modern debates over Scottish independence. In England, reactions were generally more positive, although there was little of the triumphalism that might have been expected. Many English citizens viewed the Union pragmatically, as a means to secure national security and prosperity. There was, however, lingering condescension towards Scots, who were often perceived as economic migrants and political troublemakers. Such attitudes complicated the development of a shared British identity and sowed the seeds for future tensions. The long-term effects of the Union on Scottish identity were complex. While Scotland retained its distinct institutions, the integration into the British state profoundly altered Scottish political, economic, and cultural life. Economically, Scotland benefited from access to English markets and colonial trade, leading to a period of rapid growth known as the Scottish Enlightenment. Intellectuals such as David Hume and Adam Smith emerged, profoundly influencing Western thought. Culturally, however, many Scots grappled with the tension between Britishness and Scottishness, a dynamic that continues to shape Scottish identity to this day. In the immediate aftermath of the Union, efforts were made to promote a sense of British patriotism. Symbols such as the Union Jack were introduced to foster unity. Yet, beneath the surface, regional identities remained strong. Highland clans, in particular, were resistant to British authority, culminating in the Jacobite uprisings of 1715 and 1745. These rebellions were as much about Scottish nationalism as they were about restoring the Stuart monarchy. Queen Anne's role in the Union must be understood as both catalytic and symbolic. Without her steady commitment to the project, the Union might never have been realized, and embodied the ideal of unity in her person, presiding over the merging of two often hostile realms into a single polity. Her reign, though often overshadowed by the military achievements of the Duke of Marlborough and the political machinations of figures like Robert Harley, achieved a lasting and transformative legacy in the Act of Union. The Union also had significant constitutional implications. It set a precedent for parliamentary sovereignty, as the parliaments of both England and Scotland had to agree to dissolve themselves in favour of a new British Parliament. This voluntary ceding of power would influence later political developments, including the expansion of the British Empire and the evolution of democratic governance. Yet, the Union was not a perfect solution. It papered over significant cultural, religious, and political differences that would continue to erupt in the centuries to follow. In many ways, the Act of Union was less a conclusion than a new beginning, inaugurating a complex and often fraught relationship between Scotland and England. It remains a subject of debate and contention, particularly in light of contemporary movements for Scottish independence. In sum, the Union of 1707 was a monumental event shaped by pragmatic considerations, political necessity, and personal convictions. Queen Anne's leadership and support were instrumental in overcoming the considerable obstacles to union. The Act of Union forged a new nation, one that would go on to wield unprecedented global influence. Yet, it also left unresolved questions of identity, sovereignty, and autonomy that continue to resonate in British and Scottish political life today. The story of the Union is, ultimately, a story of compromise and ambition, loyalty and resentment, unity and division, themes that have defined Britain ever since. The early 18th century was a time of immense political tension, uncertainty, and transformation within the British Isles. As the 17th century closed, England and Scotland found themselves in an uneasy partnership under the same monarch but with separate parliaments, separate legal systems, and a long history of rivalry and mutual suspicion. The political climate leading up to the Act of Union in 1707 was shaped by the urgent need for political stability, religious uniformity, economic survival, and a shared fear of foreign threats. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when William of Orange and Mary II ascended the English throne, the question of succession became critical. William and Mary had no children, and their successor, Queen Anne, likewise failed to produce a surviving heir. This instability alarmed the English government, which sought to ensure a Protestant succession and prevent any return to Catholic monarchy. The Act of Settlement of 1701 stipulated that upon Anne's death, the throne would pass to the Protestant House of Hanover. Scotland, however, asserted its right to choose its own successor through the Act of Security, 1704, raising the frightening possibility of two separate monarchs ruling England and Scotland, potentially leading the kingdoms into open conflict once again. The political atmosphere grew more strained when England retaliated with the Alien Act of 1705, threatening to cut off Scottish access to English markets and citizenship unless negotiations for union were initiated. England's primary concern was national security. With the War of the Spanish Succession raging across Europe, England feared that a Scotland free to choose its monarch might side with France, the traditional enemy of England. Meanwhile, Scotland was grappling with profound economic hardships. The failure of the Darien scheme, a disastrous attempt to establish a Scottish colony in Panama, had bankrupted much of Scotland's elite and deeply damaged the nation's economy. A closer union with England promised access to the vast English colonial markets and financial stability, which made it an attractive, if painful, consideration for many pragmatic Scots. Queen Anne's personal support for the Union was central to its realization. She was a devout Protestant and deeply committed to the idea of securing a Protestant succession for the British Isles. She recognized that political disunity would only invite chaos, external threats, and possibly even civil war. For Anne, uniting her two realms under one government was not just a political necessity. It was a moral imperative. She viewed herself as the rightful sovereign of a single British nation, and believed it was her divine duty to bring her subjects together under a common crown and parliament. Furthermore, and like many of her advisers, saw the Union as a means of strengthening the monarchy itself against the rising tide of parliamentary power and factionalism that had marked the late Stuart period. The road to union, however, was anything but smooth. The complexities of negotiating a union between two proud and historically antagonistic nations were enormous. Opposition to the union was strong and widespread in Scotland. Many Scots saw the proposed treaty as a betrayal of their sovereignty, traditions, and national pride. Ordinary Scots were deeply suspicious of English motives, fearing domination and exploitation. Riots erupted in Scottish cities such as Edinburgh and Glasgow as news of the proposed union spread. The Scottish Parliament itself was deeply divided, with some members staunchly opposed to any surrender of independence. The negotiations were delicate and often bitter. English negotiators were determined to safeguard English interests above all else, particularly concerning trade, taxation, and foreign policy. Scots demanded guarantees that their distinct legal, educational, and religious institutions would be preserved. Economic issues were perhaps the most contentious. Scotland's economy was fragile, and the financial losses from the Darien disaster loomed large over the discussions. One of the key compromises was the provision of the equivalent, a payment of nearly £400,000 from England to Scotland. This sum was intended to compensate Scots for assuming a share of England's national debt and to smooth the transition into a unified economic system. Despite fierce opposition, sufficient incentives and pressure ensured that the Scottish Parliament eventually ratified the Treaty of Union. Bribery, patronage, and political maneuvering played no small part. Many members of the Scottish elite were offered titles, pensions, and commercial opportunities in exchange for their support. Yet it would be an oversimplification to attribute the Union solely to corruption. There was a genuine, if grudging, recognition among some Scottish politicians that union with England offered the best chance for long-term national survival in an increasingly interconnected and competitive world. Queen Anne's role in this process, while often behind the scenes, was nonetheless crucial. She carefully managed her advisers and the political factions at her court to maintain momentum for the Union. Her speeches to Parliament consistently emphasized the need for unity, peace, and stability. She also made symbolic gestures to foster a sense of shared identity, such as commissioning the design of a new royal standard for the United Kingdom, and understood the importance of presenting the Union not as a conquest of Scotland by England, but as the creation of a new, stronger Britain. The Act of Union came into effect on May 1, 1707. England and Scotland were henceforth to be united into one kingdom by the name of Great Britain. The two parliaments were merged into a single parliament at Westminster, though Scotland retained its own legal system, church, and education system. The implications of the Union for Britain's future were profound. Politically, it created a more centralized and powerful state, better able to project its influence abroad and defend itself against external threats. Economically, it opened up the vast markets of England and its colonies to Scottish merchants, leading to an eventual economic revival in Scotland, particularly in the 18th century. The Union also laid the foundations for the expansion of the British Empire. Scots played a disproportionately large role in Britain's imperial ventures in the decades that followed. Scottish soldiers, administrators, and traders spread across the British Empire, from North America to India, helping to build the structures of British global power. Culturally, however, the Union had more ambiguous consequences. While it fostered a burgeoning sense of British identity, it also created tensions and contradictions that would endure for centuries. Public reactions to the Union were deeply divided. In Scotland, anger and resentment were widespread. Many ordinary Scots felt betrayed by their leaders, whom they accused of selling out Scotland for personal gain. Anti-Union pamphlets, songs, and sermons circulated widely. The loss of the Scottish Parliament was particularly bitter for nationalists, who saw it as the end of Scottish political autonomy. For decades after 1707, the Union remained a sore point in Scottish politics, fueling later movements for autonomy and independence. In England, the Union was generally seen as a strategic success, though it did not evoke widespread public enthusiasm. Many Englishmen regarded the Scots with suspicion, viewing them as economic competitors or political malcontents. Stereotypes and prejudices flourished on both sides of the border, complicating the development of a unified British identity. Nonetheless, the practical benefits of the Union, greater security, expanded trade, and a stronger monarchy, gradually became apparent, and over time, the idea of Britain as a single nation took firmer root. The long-term effects of the Union on Scottish identity were complex and multifaceted. On one hand, Scotland retained significant elements of its distinctiveness. The Scottish legal system, the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, and Scottish universities remained separate from their English counterparts, preserving key aspects of Scottish culture and social structure. Scottish intellectual life flourished in the 18th century, culminating in the Scottish Enlightenment, a period of remarkable contributions to philosophy, economics, science, and the arts. Figures such as David Hume, Adam Smith, and Robert Burns exemplified the unique blend of Scottish and British identities that emerged from the Union. On the other hand, many Scots continued to feel a sense of loss and marginalisation. The Union had been imposed under duress and was widely perceived as illegitimate among the general population. This lingering resentment occasionally flared into political movements, such as the Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745, which sought to undo the Union and restore the Stuart monarchy. Although these rebellions ultimately failed, they revealed the depth of Scottish dissatisfaction and the persistence of a distinct national consciousness. In the centuries that followed, the relationship between Scotland and the rest of Britain would continue to evolve. The Union enabled Scotland to participate fully in the British Empire and the Industrial Revolution, bringing unprecedented wealth and modernisation to many parts of the country. Scottish cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh became centres of commerce, innovation, and learning. Yet the tensions between Scottish and British identities never fully disappeared. Debates over Home Rule, devolution, and independence would resurface repeatedly, culminating in the establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999 and the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence. Ultimately, the Union of 1707 was a defining moment not only for Scotland and England but for the entire course of British history. It transformed two often hostile neighbours into partners in a powerful new state that would go on to play a dominant role in world affairs. It also left a complicated legacy of pride, resentment, adaptation, and resistance that continues to shape British and Scottish identities to this day. Queen and /U 2019's vision of a united Britain succeeded in creating a stronger, more resilient nation, but it did so at the cost of unleashing centuries of political and cultural negotiation over what it meant to be British /U 2014 and what it meant to be Scottish within that union. Queen Anne's reign marked a poignant and tumultuous end to the Stuart line, a dynasty that had ruled with intermittent brilliance and persistent conflict for over a century. Her time on the throne was overshadowed by her persistent health problems and her tragic inability to secure the succession through a living heir. Anne, born in 1665 to James II and Hyde, suffered from numerous illnesses throughout her life, including gout, obesity, and what would today likely be diagnosed as lupus or an autoimmune disorder. Her health deteriorated steadily over the years, and her many pregnancies, 17 in total, resulted in either miscarriages, stillbirths, or children who did not survive infancy. Only one child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, lived beyond infancy, but even he died at the tender age of 11 in 1700, shattering any hopes Anne might have had of securing the Stuart succession through her own lineage. The question of who would inherit the throne became a matter of profound political anxiety as Anne's health worsened, and it became clear she would not produce another heir. In an era where the monarch was a symbol of national stability, the absence of a direct successor was nothing short of a crisis. Religious tensions further complicated the matter. England, still bearing the scars of the Catholic-Protestant divide that had fueled previous conflicts like the Glorious Revolution, was adamantly determined not to see a return of a Catholic monarch. Anne herself was a devout Anglican, and despite her familial loyalty, she accepted Parliament's decision that the throne must remain firmly Protestant. Thus, attention turned to the broader family tree to find a Protestant heir. Parliament acted decisively with the Act of Settlement in 1701, stipulating that if Anne died without an heir, the crown would pass to the nearest Protestant relative. This effectively bypassed dozens of Catholic claimants, most notably James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Old Pretender, the son of James II. Instead, the Act selected Sophia of Hanover, granddaughter of James I of England and VI of Scotland, and her Protestant descendants as the rightful heirs. This legal mechanism was monumental in shaping the future of the British monarchy and reflected a profound shift in political philosophy. The succession was no longer an unquestionable matter of divine right, but a matter subject to parliamentary law and Protestant supremacy. Sophia's death shortly before Anne's in 1714 complicated matters slightly, but her son, George, Elector of Hanover, was next in line. George was a somewhat reluctant and foreign figure to most Englishmen. He spoke little English and had spent his life in the courts of the German principalities. Nonetheless, he was Protestant and legally the rightful heir, making him the chosen instrument to continue the constitutional monarchy envisioned by the architects of the Glorious Revolution. Queen Anne's final years were marked by profound personal suffering and political instability. Her body was so swollen with gout that she could barely walk, and she had to be carried around in a chair. Her political influence waned as rival factions at court, primarily the Whigs and Tories, jockeyed for power, each trying to secure their influence in the impending Hanoverian succession. Anne, who had once wielded significant political influence through her close relationships with advisors such as Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, now found herself isolated and vulnerable. Her health continued to decline sharply in 1713 and 1714, leading to prolonged periods where she was incapable of attending to state affairs. Ministers often found themselves making decisions without royal assent, a situation that highlighted the necessity of a clear and immediate successor. On August 1, 1714, Queen Anne died at Kensington Palace. She was 49 years old. The death of the last Stuart monarch was a solemn occasion, signaling not only the end of a personal saga of loss and perseverance but also the conclusion of an entire dynastic chapter in British history. Immediately upon Anne's death, the carefully laid plans of Parliament sprang into action. George of Hanover was proclaimed King George I of Great Britain and Ireland. Though he was not crowned until October, his ascension was rapid and without serious opposition, thanks largely to the foresight of the Act of Settlement and the firm resolve of Parliament to avoid a Catholic restoration at all costs. The immediate aftermath of Anne's death was one of both relief and uncertainty. Relief, because the succession crisis, long feared, had been averted without bloodshed. Uncertainty, because George I was an unknown quantity to his new subjects. His arrival from Hanover was met with a mixture of indifference, curiosity, and quiet resentment among the populace. Many Tories who had secretly harbored Jacobite sympathies mourned Anne's passing and viewed George with suspicion, seeing in him a German interloper rather than a legitimate king. However, George I's accession marked a definitive pivot towards a more constitutional form of monarchy, one where Parliament and the rule of law held the real reins of power. The transition from the Stuart to the Hanoverian dynasty was not without its challenges. In 1715, the Jacobite rising sought to restore James Francis Edward Stuart to the throne, capitalizing on the unease that followed Anne's death. Yet the rebellion was poorly organized and swiftly suppressed, a testament to how deeply the political elite had committed to the Protestant succession and parliamentary sovereignty. The Stuart dream of a Catholic restoration died a slow and painful death in the decades that followed, culminating in the failure of the later Jacobite uprising in 1745 led by Charles Edward Stuart, the Young Pretender. Reflecting on the legacy of the Stuarts, one cannot help but see their story as a tapestry woven with both grandeur and tragedy. Beginning with James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, the Stuarts had navigated the unification of crowns, the challenges of religious schism, civil war, regicide, restoration, revolution, and exile. Their legacy is profoundly mixed. They presided over some of the most tumultuous and transformative events in British history, yet their rule is often remembered as a cautionary tale of the dangers of absolutism, religious intolerance, and dynastic pride. Queen Anne's reign, in particular, stands out as a moment of profound transition. Under her rule, the foundations of the modern British state were laid. The Acts of Union in 1707 united England and Scotland into a single kingdom of Great Britain. The development of the two-party system between Whigs and Tories took firmer root, and the principles of a constitutional monarchy were tested and solidified. Yet personally, Anne's life was one of relentless sorrow, marred by personal losses, betrayals, and physical suffering. Her death symbolized the end not just of a dynasty but of an entire worldview. The idea that monarchy was rooted in divine right and personal rule rather than constitutional limits and parliamentary governance. The passing of the throne to the House of Hanover represented more than just a change in dynasty. It marked the beginning of a new political reality. Under the Hanoverians, especially beginning with George I and his successor George II, the role of the monarch continued to diminish as Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, rose in prominence. The office of the Prime Minister emerged in earnest, with figures like Sir Robert Walpole exercising real executive authority. Britain moved decisively towards the constitutional system that would later become the model for many democracies around the world. In retrospect, the death of Queen Anne closed the door on a chapter of British history defined by personal rule, religious conflict, and dynastic ambition. It opened a new era characterized by political modernization, economic expansion, and imperial growth. The Stuart name, once synonymous with the grandeur of monarchy, would become increasingly associated with nostalgia and romanticized rebellion, particularly among those sympathetic to the Jacobite cause. Poets, writers, and later historians would paint the Stuarts in varying shades, some viewing them as tragic heroes, others as obstinate reactionaries unable to adapt to the demands of a changing world. Yet in her final moments, Queen Anne embodied the contradictions of the Stuart legacy. A monarch fiercely loyal to her subjects and her church, she presided over the end of her own line with a stoicism that spoke to her personal strength, even as her body failed her. Her death was not accompanied by civil war or foreign invasion, but rather by a remarkably orderly transition, a testament to the political maturity Britain had achieved by the early 18th century. Thus, the death of Queen Anne can truly be seen as the final chapter of the Stuart monarchy. It was an ending filled with sadness, but also with a sense of inevitable closure. The Stuart dynasty, once so vibrant under kings like James VI and Charles II, had exhausted itself through a series of religious and political missteps. Their dream of an unchallenged monarchy had been replaced by the realities of constitutional government. Anne's passing marked not just the end of a royal line but the end of an old world, one in which monarchy stood supreme, giving way to a new age where the will of the people, as expressed through their representatives, would increasingly determine the fate of the nation. The Stuart line ended not with the clash of armies or the thunder of rebellion, but with the quiet expiration of a sick and sorrowful queen in a palace just outside London. In that quiet passing, a dynasty faded into history, leaving behind a Britain ready to move forward into the complexities and challenges of the modern era. Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, ruled a nation in the midst of significant political, religious, and social transformation. Her reign, which lasted from 1702 to 1714, is often overshadowed by the events that followed her death, particularly the ascension of the Hanoverian dynasty, which marked the beginning of a new era in British history. However, a closer examination of Anne's reign reveals that it was a crucial turning point, not just for Britain, but for the evolution of monarchy itself. When Queen Anne ascended to the throne in 1702, she inherited a kingdom that was both politically divided and religiously fragmented. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which had deposed her father, King James II, and replaced him with William of Orange and his wife Mary II, had left a lasting impact on the British monarchy. The revolution, which was partly motivated by fears of a Catholic restoration, had established the Protestant succession as a foundational principle of British constitutional law. It had also cemented Parliament's role in the governance of the nation, limiting the power of the monarch and setting the stage for the eventual rise of parliamentary sovereignty. Anne's reign can be seen as a continuation of this trend toward parliamentary control, but it was also marked by significant personal and political challenges. Unlike her predecessors, Anne did not wield the same level of power or influence. Her personal health struggles, which were severe and chronic, limited her ability to exercise full control over her government. She was often ill and, by the end of her reign, was physically debilitated by gout, obesity, and other health issues. This weakened her authority and made her highly reliant on her ministers and advisors. Yet, despite these challenges, Anne's reign saw several important milestones in British history. The most significant of these was the Act of Union in 1707, which united England and Scotland into a single kingdom, Great Britain. This was a monumental achievement, one that and supported despite considerable opposition from both sides. The union not only solidified Britain's position as a unified political entity, but it also had far-reaching consequences for the future of the British Empire. It laid the foundation for a more centralized and efficient government, one that would be better positioned to manage the growing demands of empire in the centuries to come. Anne's reign also saw the continuation of the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, a conflict that pitted Britain and its allies against France and Spain. The war was a defining moment in Anne's reign, both politically and personally. Anne's decision to support the war, and her reliance on her military commanders, particularly the Duke of Marlborough, helped to shape the course of British foreign policy and establish Britain as a leading European power. However, the war also drained the nation's resources and left many of Anne's subjects disillusioned with the ongoing conflict, particularly as the war dragged on with no clear resolution. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the war, was seen as a significant diplomatic victory for Britain, but it also marked the end of Anne's reign and the beginning of a new political era. Despite her accomplishments, Anne's reign is often viewed through the lens of the political and dynastic instability that marked her final years. Her inability to produce a surviving heir, combined with her declining health, created a succession crisis that ultimately led to the end of the Stuart dynasty. The Act of Settlement, 1701, which ensured that the throne would pass to the Protestant House of Hanover in the event of Anne's death without an heir, set the stage for the ascension of George I and the beginning of the Hanoverian era. Anne's death in 1714 marked the end of a century of Stuart rule and the start of a new chapter in British history, one that would see the further development of constitutional monarchy and the strengthening of parliamentary power. In the centuries since Anne's death, historians have debated the significance of her reign. On one hand, her time on the throne is often seen as a period of political stability and constitutional development. The Act of Union, for example, is widely regarded as one of the most important pieces of legislation in British history, as it helped to consolidate the disparate kingdoms of England and Scotland into a single, more cohesive entity. The Treaty of Utrecht, too, is considered a major diplomatic achievement, as it secured Britain's position as a leading European power and set the stage for the expansion of the British Empire. On the other hand, Anne's reign is also viewed as one of missed opportunities. Her ill health and reliance on her ministers prevented her from fully capitalizing on the political potential of her reign. Her inability to secure a male heir, despite her many pregnancies, left the throne vulnerable to external challenges, and the dynastic uncertainty that characterized her final years contributed to the eventual downfall of the Stuart dynasty. One of the key aspects of Anne's legacy is the way in which her reign shaped the future of the British monarchy. While Anne may not have been able to exert the same level of personal influence as her predecessors, her reign nevertheless marked a significant turning point in the evolution of monarchy in Britain. Her reign saw the gradual decline of absolute monarchy and the rise of parliamentary sovereignty. The Glorious Revolution had already established the principle that the monarch could not rule without the consent of Parliament, but it was during Anne's reign that the power of the legislature became increasingly evident. Anne's health problems and political struggles highlighted the limitations of the monarchy, and her reliance on ministers like Robert Harley and the Duke of Marlborough underscored the growing influence of the political class. Anne's reign also marked the beginning of a shift in the relationship between the monarch and the court. While the Stuart monarchs had traditionally relied on personal favorites and political factions to maintain their power, Anne's court was marked by greater political polarization and division. The Tories and Whigs, two rival political factions, vied for influence during her reign, and their competing interests played a key role in shaping the policies of her government. The influence of court favorites like Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, also shaped Anne's decision-making, and her relationship with Sarah was both a source of political tension and personal turmoil. This tension between personal loyalty and political ambition became a defining feature of Anne's reign, and it would continue to influence British politics in the years to come. In popular culture, Queen Anne is often remembered as a tragic figure, a woman whose reign was marred by personal loss and political instability. Her health problems, the death of her children, and her eventual inability to secure the succession have made her a sympathetic figure in many historical narratives. However, Her reign is also remembered as one of achievement and resilience. The Act of Union and the Treaty of Utrecht are both seen as lasting legacies of her rule, and they helped to shape the political and cultural landscape of Britain for generations. Anne's reign also set the stage for the transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, a process that would continue under her Hanoverian successors. When compared to other monarchs of the Stuart period, Anne's reign stands out for its relative stability and political pragmatism. Unlike her father, James II, whose Catholicism and absolutist tendencies had sparked the Glorious Revolution, and was a devout Anglican who was largely seen as a stabilizing force in a time of political and religious upheaval. Her reign was not marked by the same level of conflict or rebellion as those of her predecessors, and her ability to maintain a degree of political unity in a divided nation is seen as one of her key achievements. However, Anne's reign was also characterized by personal tragedy and political challenges, and her inability to secure the succession left a legacy of dynastic instability that would have lasting consequences for the future of the monarchy. In conclusion, Queen Anne's legacy is one of both achievement and missed opportunity. Her reign saw significant political and cultural changes that would have a lasting impact on British history, including the Act of Union, the Treaty of Utrecht, and the gradual shift toward parliamentary sovereignty. However, her reign was also marked by personal loss, political divisions, and dynastic uncertainty. The end of the Stuart dynasty with Anne's death in 1714 marked the beginning of a new era in British history, one that would see the rise of the Hanoverian monarchy and the further development of the British constitutional system. While Queen Anne may not have been able to fully capitalize on the potential of her reign, her legacy as the last Stuart monarch remains a significant chapter in the story of the British monarchy. Queen Anne's reign, though often overshadowed by the political and dynastic transitions that followed her death, was a time of significant cultural flourishing in Britain. Despite her personal health struggles and political challenges, Anne's court became a center for the arts, literature, and intellectual exchange, contributing to the cultural and intellectual development of the early 18th century. Her support for artists, writers, and thinkers laid the groundwork for many of the cultural movements that would define the Georgian period, including the rise of the Enlightenment. One of Queen Anne's most notable contributions to British culture was her patronage of the arts. Her reign saw the continuation of a trend toward greater state support for artistic and cultural endeavors that had begun during the reign of her predecessors, particularly the Restoration monarchy under Charles II. Anne's court was a vibrant space for the flourishing of literature, theatre, music, and visual arts, though her own personal tastes leaned toward the conservative and traditional. She was not as personally invested in the arts as some of her contemporaries, such as Louis XIV of France, but her support was crucial in allowing a number of key figures to thrive. The period of Anne's reign saw the rise of several important cultural movements, including the development of early Enlightenment thought. Though the full flowering of the Enlightenment would not occur until the 18th century, Anne's reign laid the groundwork for the intellectual shift that would later characterize much of European thought. The political and religious changes of the time, the consolidation of the Protestant state, and the slow but steady rise of parliamentary sovereignty, created a fertile environment for new ways of thinking. Philosophers, scientists, and writers, many of whom would come to prominence in the following decades, began to question traditional structures of power, authority, and knowledge, sparking the intellectual revolution that would reshape Europe in the century to come. During Anne's reign, Britain was becoming increasingly aware of its place in a globalized world. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, and the subsequent Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, not only reshaped the political landscape of Europe but also had long-lasting consequences for Britain's cultural identity. The war and its outcomes positioned Britain as a leading European power and set the stage for its imperial expansion. The defeat of France and Spain, which were major Catholic powers, solidified Britain's Protestant identity, and this religious and political development was reflected in cultural output across the country. The growing sense of British identity, distinct from both continental Europe and its own Celtic neighbors, began to find expression in literature, art, and music during this period. The contributions of key cultural figures during Queen Anne's reign were significant in shaping the trajectory of British culture. Writers like Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, and Joseph Addison made important strides in literature, contributing to the development of the novel, satire, and periodical journalism. These figures, many of whom were associated with the Scriblerus Club, helped define a distinctly British form of wit and social critique that would influence later writers like Samuel Johnson and the Romantics. Swift's Gulliver's Travels, 1726, though published after Anne's death, reflects the cultural currents that were beginning to coalesce during her reign. Similarly, Addison and Steele's The Tatler and The Spectator helped to shape modern British journalism and the literary essay. The visual arts also flourished under Anne's reign, though in a more restrained way than in some other European courts. Painters like Godfrey Kneller and John Vanbrugh, the latter of whom was also an architect, became prominent figures in the early 18th century art scene. Kneller's portraits of Anne and her courtiers remain some of the most well-known depictions of the period, capturing the monarch's dignified and regal presence. The development of British portraiture, particularly in the tradition of royal portraiture, was a key component of the cultural life of Anne's court. Queen Anne's reign also saw the continued development of British literature, including the first stirrings of the novel form. While the novel would not reach its full potential until the mid-18th century, Anne's reign saw the first experiments with the genre, particularly through the works of writers such as Daniel Defoe and Aphra Behn. Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, 1719, though published after Anne's death, can be seen as the culmination of a literary movement that began during her reign and was driven by the changing social and political climate of the time. Anne's role as a monarch also had an influence on the development of British political culture. Her reign marked the increasing centrality of the Whig and Tory parties, and their rivalries became a defining feature of British political life. This growing party system influenced not only politics but also public life, as political pamphlets and treatises became more widespread. The development of public opinion, fueled by the growing literacy rates and the increasing influence of the press, allowed for greater participation in the national conversation about politics, culture, and society. The periodical press, which flourished under writers like Addison and Steele, allowed for a new form of public discourse that would become a hallmark of British culture in the years to come. Despite the cultural flowering during her reign, Queen Anne's personal health struggles were a major challenge throughout her life and reign. Her obesity, gout, and other chronic illnesses severely limited her ability to govern, and her physical decline during the later years of her reign was evident. These personal struggles not only affected her ability to fulfill her royal duties, but also had a profound impact on the political landscape. As her health deteriorated, and became increasingly reliant on her ministers, particularly those of the Tory faction, who wielded significant influence in the final years of her reign. This dependence on her advisors and the internal political strife at court created an unstable environment, which had a lasting impact on British politics and governance. Queen Anne's reign also saw the development of a distinctly British national identity. The Act of Union in 1707, which unified England and Scotland into a single kingdom, played a key role in this process. The union, while controversial, represented a moment of political consolidation, and it laid the groundwork for a sense of shared British identity that would become increasingly important in the coming centuries. This emerging sense of Britishness was not just a political phenomenon but also a cultural one, as the country's growing imperial ambitions, its Protestantism, and its political stability all contributed to the formation of a more unified national identity. In terms of religion, Anne's reign was marked by continued tension between Anglicans and dissenters. While the Church of England was firmly entrenched as the state religion, the tensions between the established church and nonconformists remained a persistent issue. Queen Anne was a devout Anglican, and her personal faith was a key element of her public identity. However, her reign also saw the rise of religious tolerance and the beginnings of the secularization of British society, particularly in the intellectual circles that would later form the heart of the Enlightenment. Queen Anne's reign represents a moment of transition in British history, and her influence on the culture and society of her time was significant. While her reign is often overshadowed by the later Hanoverian period, the contributions of her court and the cultural shifts that took place under her leadership played a crucial role in the development of British identity and culture. Her support for the arts, the intellectual currents of the time, and the cultural figures who flourished during her reign all helped to shape the trajectory of British culture in the 18th century and beyond. In terms of her legacy, Queen Anne's influence is still felt today in the cultural, political, and religious developments that took place during her reign. The intellectual and cultural achievements of the early Enlightenment, the development of British literature, and the rise of a more cohesive British identity were all shaped in part by the conditions of Anne's reign. While her personal life and health struggles may have limited her ability to exert direct control over the events of her time, her reign nevertheless played a critical role in shaping the future of Britain. Comparing Queen Anne to other European monarchs of her time highlights her significance in a broader European context. Anne's foreign policy, particularly her involvement in the War of the Spanish Succession, positioned Britain as a key player in European affairs. Unlike some of her contemporaries, such as Louis XIV of France or Peter the Great of Russia, Anne did not seek to expand her territory or assert her dominance through military conquest. Instead, she focused on securing Britain's position as a global power through strategic alliances and diplomatic efforts, such as the Treaty of Utrecht. This approach to foreign policy reflected the broader European political climate of the early 18th century, where many monarchs were beginning to shift from territorial expansion to balancing power through diplomacy and strategic alliances. Anne's relationships with other European powers, particularly France and the Holy Roman Empire, were shaped by the ongoing conflict of the War of the Spanish Succession. This war, which pitted Britain and its allies against France and Spain, had a profound impact on the political landscape of Europe. For Anne, the war was a means of asserting British influence and securing its position in the European balance of power. The Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the war, was a diplomatic victory for Britain, securing its interests and marking the beginning of the decline of French influence in Europe. In terms of the broader European context, Anne's reign can be seen as part of a larger shift in the nature of monarchy and statecraft. The absolutist monarchs of the 17th century, such as Louis XIV and Charles I, were giving way to more constitutional models of governance, where the power of the monarch was increasingly constrained by law, custom, and the influence of Parliament and other governing bodies. Anne's reign was a transitional period in this shift, and while she did not wield the same absolute power as some of her predecessors, her role in the evolving British system of constitutional monarchy was nonetheless significant. Through her political decisions, her patronage of the arts, and her support for the union of England and Scotland, Queen Anne helped to shape the course of British history and the development of modern Europe. Queen Anne's reign, though often overshadowed by the transition to the Hanoverian monarchy, holds a vital place in British history. As the last monarch of the Stuart dynasty, her time on the throne marked the end of an era that had been filled with both triumphs and turmoil. Queen Anne's reign was significant for several reasons, including her role in the unification of England and Scotland, her involvement in the War of the Spanish Succession, and the political shifts that took place under her rule. Her personal struggles and health issues, along with the political intrigue at her court, shaped the nature of her reign and left a lasting legacy. One of the most notable aspects of Queen Anne's reign was the transition it symbolized: the end of the Stuart dynasty and the beginning of the Hanoverian monarchy. The death of and without a direct heir set the stage for the passing of the crown to the House of Hanover, a shift that would have profound implications for both the British monarchy and the wider political landscape. The Act of Settlement in 1701, which ensured the throne would pass to a Protestant successor, was a critical factor in this transition. While Anne's reign was marked by internal political divisions, particularly between the Whigs and Tories, her death ushered in a new era in British history that saw the strengthening of the constitutional monarchy and the rise of parliamentary power. Historians continue to debate Queen Anne's legacy, with some viewing her as a monarch whose reign was largely defined by political maneuvering and the absence of a strong personal hand in governance. Her reliance on ministers such as Robert Harley and Viscount Bolingbroke, and the tensions with figures like Sarah Churchill, suggests a monarch who struggled to assert her authority in the face of political factionalism. Yet, despite these challenges, Queen Anne's reign cannot be dismissed as inconsequential. Her role in the union of England and Scotland in 1707 was pivotal, solidifying the political structure that would define Great Britain in the centuries to come. Additionally, her involvement in the War of the Spanish Succession demonstrated her strategic acumen, though the war's outcome and the treaty negotiations reflected both successes and failures. Moreover, Queen Anne's legacy is also reflected in the cultural and intellectual developments of her time. Her court became a center for the arts, literature, and early Enlightenment thought, laying the groundwork for the intellectual movements that would shape the 18th century. Figures such as Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, and Joseph Addison emerged during her reign, and their contributions to British literature and political thought have had a lasting impact on the country's cultural heritage. Her reign was also marked by the early rise of political journalism, with publications like The Tatler and The Spectator setting the stage for modern British media. In terms of the broader scope of the British monarchy, Queen Anne's reign was both a culmination of Stuart rule and a moment of transition. While her reign marked the final chapter of a dynastic line, it also heralded the shift towards a more parliamentary monarchy, one where the king or queen's power was increasingly limited by the will of the people and the influence of the government. Anne's reign, though short and marked by personal and political struggles, laid the foundations for the Hanoverian era, which would see the monarchy evolve into a more symbolic institution, with the real political power residing in Parliament. Queen Anne's reign was marked by significant political, cultural, and social changes. As the last Stuart monarch, she witnessed the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in British history. Her political decisions, though sometimes contentious, were crucial in shaping the future of the British monarchy and the nation itself. While her reign may not have been as dramatic as those of some of her predecessors, her impact on British history is undeniable. The transition from the Stuarts to the Hanoverians, her support for the arts, and her role in the political developments of the time ensure that Queen Anne remains an important figure in the broader narrative of British monarchy and history.